core values to valued culture. Here is your host, Will Scott, interviewing another CEO about leading culture in their company.
Welcome to another Culture Czars interview where we talk to CEOs that care about corporate culture. We call this series From Core Values to Valued Culture, and our purpose is to help CEOs create environments where employees love where they work and why they work. My guest today is Andrew Blickstein, who was very successful at doing just that at his company, Home Run Media. So, Andrew, CEO of Home Run Media, hello.
Hello, Will. Thanks for having me on the vlog today.
Of course, we have been friends for a long time too, and members of the Entrepreneurs Organization, so there is that connection. But Andrew, let's start by telling us what was the purpose of Home Run Media?
So our core purpose was to create a platform for others to succeed. In short, we were a media buying agency. We specialized in analytics for television commercials. But one of the things that I realized very early in owning an agency is that there are very few assets within the agency. As a matter of fact, we may talk about this a little bit further on in the podcast. One of our core values was our assets go home every night. I understood that the biggest assets in an agency environment are not the software platform that we lease or the commercials that we don't own. They're owned by our clients. But the thing that we really brought to the table was the people. That was the assets of the organization.
Yeah, cool. And what do you think about when we talk about culture in a company?
Well, what do I think about when we talk about culture? So my initial reaction to that is this idea that I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's what people do when no one else is looking, right? It's that idea of having the right values in the organization, because that's really what it comes down to me. Culture can be successful lots of different ways. I had one of my very first bosses in the industry was a very financial focused leader, which is fine. That's the culture that he chose to build, and that's the values that he chose to build his team and organization around. And there's nothing wrong with that. The idea that culture is this poor ping pong table, but it probably comes up in every podcast, but the idea that culture are beer taps and ping pong tables isn't exactly right. Those support a type of culture potentially. They can also potentially be very big distractions. So culture is it's very individual. What's important is when there is a culture to keep building on the culture, no matter what it is, and make it a healthy place for people to be, attract the right people into the culture. But cultures can come in all different shapes and sizes. It's not just fun.
Indeed. And what were some of the things that you did to make sure that culture was maintained the way you wanted it, and that you were also adding people to the frame that were compliant with your culture and made like a fit with the other folks that you had? I know you did some cool things there. Yeah,
so for us, we took it extremely seriously, potentially overboard sometimes. We started our culture indoctrination. So we had a sheet that was day zero was an employee's first day. And the sheet would tick off activities that either the employee or the team needed to do. Here's the interesting thing about to help build culture, to help ensure that they understand our core values. One of the things that was interesting is you can imagine it went from day zero to day plus 60. So it's a 60-day timeline really after their start. But the sheet actually started on day minus 75. So we started indoctrinating our employees into our culture as candidates before they even became prospects to some degree. And we had multiple little different ways across the recruiting and onboarding chain to ensure that happens. And I think that those little tools that we inserted throughout really helped us bring the people with the right foundation the right values into our business. And that once we have the right values in our business, the culture, we have a great foundation to keep working on the culture.
Because you were talking earlier about, I think sort of alluding to the fact that there is this idea about people behaving in values, whether anyone's looking or not, which is one of the sort of definitions of integrity, a value people often adopt. But it's about a feeling too, about how do you feel working in that space and with the people that you spend 8 hours at least a day with. And so when you were thinking about day zero, which is the day they started, I've heard a lot of people say that's the most important day of a new employee's start, and you want them to feel great about that day. So what sort of things were you doing specifically on day zero to make people feel great and feel welcome?
So we had a program, we called it BFD, which stood for Big First Day. And
wow, you really took the first day very seriously. Day zero, BFD.
Big First Day. And a couple of things. So we always made people's first days on Tuesdays, because one of the very first things that they had was kind of a core values talk from me, the CEO. And I was just too busy on Mondays to do it. So there are a couple of things we find that are, it's like, here's another example. Paperwork to start, filling out your paperwork for payroll and a couple of other, you call it state forms or government forms. Like, here's the dirty secret. Those don't need to be done on the first day. I always felt that, congratulations, come to work. Your start time is 8:58 a.m. And then it's like, by the way, go sit in a conference room alone and fill out this paperwork. It was a horrible first day. So we really, depending at times, sometimes we'd send it in advance, eventually became our process. A lot of times we had people do it on day 2 or 3. But we would really look at taking care of the little things. And an example would be everyone had business cards on their desk on day 1. Not the blank business cards that every new employee gets that most companies order a couple thousand of, with their name and their title and their phone number and their mobile number and their email address on their desk. We had their computer sitting on their desk, and we would have someone in the office that would just preload software and create passwords for everyone, so they could really come in and understood that we took care of little things. The final story I'll tell you is we had something called a culture interview, and we had a particular employee who would run this interview, and he had a list of 20 questions that would change a little bit over time. But one of the key questions in it was, what's your favorite flower? Which is such a random thing. But when they showed up on day 1 and there were flowers on their desk, by the way, BFD was Big First Day. It was also balloons, flowers, and delivery, because we would deliver them dinner that night too. The flowers were their favorite flower that they had mentioned in their interview. So we would look at those things as really indoctrinating our culture from the beginning. So the little things. We would deal with massive budgets for our clients on very small margins. We had to be very buckled down. We would earn 5, 6, 8% at a time, and if we made an error, we cover the 92%. So we could really dig ourselves in our holes. So one of the things about all these, like the flowers, started to become that lesson of pay attention to the details are really important around here. Or the other part of that lesson was, sometimes we're going to ask you for some things that may not quite make sense, but you're going to have to trust there's a reason for these things out there. And over the course of the day or the first week or two, we kind of pull them aside and consistently coach them or help them observe these things, we'll say. The flowers on your dress. Remember we asked you that question? We did that because it's super important for detail around here. So from day 1, we'd start.
So it's starting to train them as well, and perhaps help them understand what your values were and what were important to you, such as caring about the small things and details.
Yeah, and they were important to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's important to me is important
indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So everyone in the organization was really focused on these things. And that's the type of foundation I was talking about, bringing people in with the right foundation. So when we teach them these lessons, they can use them.
That's very cool. I'm sure it would feel amazing to come into a first day like that, a BFD like that. Do you remember any stories from what people said who went through that experience? Were there any kind of, wow, Andrew, that was an amazing first day?
I'll tell you where we would get it the most. So one of the parts of our program is we would ask them to fill out their paperwork ahead of time. The real reason we moved the paperwork ahead of time from day 2 or 3 is so we could get their emergency contact. The emergency contact was typically a spouse or a partner if they were married or committed. And if not, it was usually a parent. And one of the things that we would do is not only would there be flowers on the desk of the new coworker, we would send flowers or typically dinner to their partner on their first day also. And it was the reaction on day 2 when the employee came back and they were like, I was floored when you brought me lunch and it was my favorite lunch and there were flowers and it was my favorite. But boy, when I got home and my spouse was telling me what a great company I work for, which by the way is really the net effect from it. That's when we really got the reaction. We always viewed it as, we're not just taking a person. We understand that we're playing a role in supporting their family and their family's well-being. And we would want a little buy-in from the family too. So there were going to be days we're an advertising agency. There are days or I should say nights with late nights. And we really wanted their partner to understand why it was important, not just the organization, but really to their partner, our employee, why they were choosing to stay late and work so hard.
Makes great sense. And lovely stories. And wow, what a lot of care you gave to that. Was that actually ever made it into a workflow, like an onboarding workflow or a process, or did you just have somebody who was great at taking care of it?
We very much brought, first of all, most important things. It's kind of saying, I spent some time as a business coach and I would say, if it's really important to get done, build a process around it. So we would really focus on building processes around probably our 20% most important activities. And onboarding a person was definitely, so we had workflows, we had sheets, we had reminder sheets, we had quizzes, we had platforms, but probably the big thing is when they would come on day 1, we had an onboarding deck, which was about 40 pages long. We would very carefully explain to them they do not need to read it cover to cover like it's a novel. But it wound up being, people would refer to it later, 6 months, 12 months later with the information we had in there. Most companies have, or most industries have industry terms or kind of company terms.
Yeah.
And we had a glossary in there of that. And that was the type of thing that roadmap from they really saw from day 0 through day 60 was really guided by them using that onboarding deck.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So a lot of effort going into that. What about some other things then down the road? I mean, once employees were there a month or a year, or were there other conversations going on around the core values or other ways of recognizing people exhibiting the core values?
Yeah, so I can't recall that we ever had like individual awards. It wasn't really a focus of ours, and I don't know. I just never. Maybe it's because I never care for them. Why would anybody else, right? Of course, but we had. There was nothing we did that wasn't tied to a core value. Nothing. We had 4 core values. I assure you. I left this business 4 years ago now. I assure you at least half the employees could still recite all 4.
Okay.
Probably more than half the employees. But things like we had a program, we called it TED Thursdays, where every Thursday I would bring in lunch for the whole company. We would all watch a TED Talk together, eat lunch together, have a discussion around it, and go back to work. It's a beautiful little format. TED Talks are 18 minutes long. We'd sit and eat lunch during the TED Talk. We'd have a 12-minute conversation curated on a rotating basis. Go. That doesn't exist in our organization without our core value of Mrs. Berry. Mrs. Berry was my high school photography teacher. And Mrs. Berry represented that we were a learning and teaching organization. One of the most impactful things Mrs. Berry ever said to me was, I don't care if you know who Georgia O'Keeffe is. I care that you know how to go to the library or the museum and figure out who Georgia O'Keeffe was. And that was largely our organization. That's why we invested in things like TED. If we could not tie an activity to a core value or a part of our one-page plan, it did not get done. So really everything we did was tied to a core value. Our daily huddle, we would rotate and talk about core values.
Very good. So Mrs. Berry then, that was obviously pre-Google then, if she was sending you to the library, huh?
Oh, yes, it was definitely.
Not to give away your age or anything.
It was definitely Dewey Decimal System time for sure. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Will.
So what about the daily huddle? How did you bring it into a daily huddle?
So daily huddle, we would rotate. So on Mondays, we would talk about numbers, but every other day of the week was tied to a specific core value. So that was our opportunity to kind of give shout outs to people, but rather than shout out rando yesterday, it would be like, shout out to Caitlin for taking the HubSpot certification. That's a way to go, Mrs. Berry, or something like that.
Okay,
so it was just an opportunity to kind of keep it focused. But, shout outs are fantastic. Any opportunity we had to reinforce our core values, we would do it. So if you do shout out, great. How do we do shout outs with core values?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, go ahead. And then, of course, in doing so, you're not only lifting that person up, but you're reminding people what the behaviors are. Like a HubSpot course is learning, is the Mrs. Berry Award or Mrs. Berry core value. So you're telling the stories that help reinforce the value. Yeah. Andrew, what advice would you give to other CEOs about core values and keeping them alive and thriving in the company?
Yeah. So the advice would be, don't do an exercise about core values. Don't bother with them at all, unless you choose to take them as seriously as any other tool you would take in your business. You can't just buy Salesforce for $50,000, put it there, and expect it to make an impact on my business because I now say I'm a licensee of Salesforce. Okay? I have to train my staff how to use it. I need to remind them how to use it, and I need to keep reinforcing its importance in our business. Just like any other tool, a software tool, a piece of real estate, or anything, don't bother investing in it unless you actually have the ability or desire to use it and understand the impact it's going to have on your business. Otherwise, they're posters on the wall, and they actually, I find, to be more disturbing and destructive when we have core values that are not, when I see organizations that have core values that are not true versus organizations that don't have them at all.
Absolutely. And for some of those stories involving a number of corporations where they had core values that they were paying no attention to and sort of behaving in the opposite of what the core values were espousing, you can check out some of those stories on my blog at cultureshouse.com. Yeah.
Famously, Enron had integrity.
Yes.
Good job.
Well, what do you think their values really were?
The almighty dollar. Well, the almighty dollar.
Make money at all costs and everyone else's costs.
Yeah.
Expense.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So can you think of any stories that were sort of folklore around Home Run Media? Maybe just that awesome employee that was always with you and did something great as a story that you retold?
Yeah, I actually can. I had one remote employee ever. And to this day, I love this person. But every once in a while, they would come up to me and they would say, how come everyone else in the office knows more than I do? And finally, I looked at them and I was like, because I don't walk past your desk to go pee. And it just became this idea of these casual drop-in conversations. But what I realized through this is it felt like having one remote employee was like having 1 foot on the dock and 1 foot on the boat, which is a very dangerous thing. 2 feet on the boat, everybody's in the house is great. 2 feet on the dock, which means we have a real program for remote employees, was great. but we had one in each, which meant we weren't really supporting this particular person as well as they needed to be supported. So now I have the choice. Do we build the support for this person, or do we let this person go into the marketplace, we'll say? Well, we decided that we didn't want to continue with the remote employees. I shouldn't say I decided that we didn't want to continue with remote employees. And it was just basically time to let this one particular person hit the marketplace. And they came to Chicago and we had a conversation and I took them for a walk. And I remember looking at them and saying, you can't come to work here anymore, but that doesn't mean that we have to stop paying you. Because we felt that bringing this person on to a position that we were not capable of supporting them in was our mistake, not their mistake. So we actually wound up, we'll call it, I don't want to say compensating beyond what we're contractually obligated to do. And I wanted to be careful not to say overcompensating because they were not overcompensated. They were compensated fairly.
Yeah, so perhaps was that also one of your core values? Did you have one of your core values that spoke to treating people fairly or anything like that?
Well, this was the one I would probably tie this one to most would be own it, which meant you got to own your successes and own your mistakes. I didn't need to, if I made a mistake, right person, wrong situation, I made that mistake. I need to own that mistake and I need to pay that mistake. And I need to make sure that this person, who, by the way, is no longer an employee, right, is done right. I used to say, still do, that core values need to live inside and outside of the organization, which means they need to live with our employees, our staff, but they also need to live largely within our clients and with all of our stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that a lot. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I don't use the word fire. And in my book, The Culture Fix, I always use the word unhire, because to me, firing somebody makes it like it's all their fault. But if you're unhiring, you're just kind of acknowledging that, hey, this isn't working out, and we hired you, now we're going to unhire you. It's sort of, there's more own it, as you would call it, for your core value around, this mistake that I or my managers or my company made.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the clock that does it too. We've all hired people that are, I can think of somebody else I hired, and they worked for me for 2 years, and they were fantastic at launching new things. And I finally had to look at them and said, you launched it. Now, unfortunately, there's not really a spot for you.
Yeah. Another big one that I like to, and I think this needs to be our last question based on time, but which I very much appreciate you coming on the podcast today. I'm not sure I thanked you at the beginning, Andrew, is because you were talking there about treating culture and core values as important as any other sort of initiative or program in the company, and perhaps even looking for the return on that. And return on culture is something that I encourage people to measure, and there are a number of ways of doing that. But would you say that return on culture was as important as the return on anything else you were doing in the company? It sounds like it.
Yeah, it was the foundation. there was no anything else without the right culture, at least not for us. Mainly because it has, as a founder, I can't say as a CEO, but as a founder, I felt it had to reflect me. I'm not going to date myself by putting a year on this. But this very first boss I mentioned, where I felt that we just didn't align in a values way, super careful to say he's not a bad person. He's a very good person, right? We just didn't align the same way. And when I finally went and opened the agency myself, what I kept telling people was I could never find a company with the right values as me, so I just had to go create one. If I then started to compromise my values, then the whole reason of the company is compromised. This, entrepreneurship, there's lots of different ways to be philanthropic. I find entrepreneurship to be a very underrated way. Entrepreneurs go create jobs and they create livelihoods. Just like I knew when I was onboarding an employee, I knew I was onboarding to some degree their whole family, and they were placing their livelihood in the trust of this business. That's my value. I also cannot hire someone out of a situation that's great for them because I want to create a platform for others to succeed. That's how I get my juice. That was the mission of the business. We did it by taking other people's money and other people's advertising assets and creating more money and more assets out of it.
Yeah.
But if we were to do it with TV commercials, we looked to do that with people. We wanted people to be better when they left the company than when they walked in. And I know damn well we did that.
Okay.
That was my mission.
Excellent. Well, that's a great way to finish. So, and you've been talking a lot about what you can do for other people, and you're saying that even though you actually, moved on from your company, that you can say that the people that you employed and had during that time, they left better than they started, and that's a great thing. So, thank you for that. And Andrew, thanks again for coming on the podcast, and really appreciate your insights, and look forward to hearing about what you're going to be doing in the next chapter of your life, where we know for sure you're going to be caring about culture and caring about the people that work in your company.
Me too, Will.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe, check us out on the web at culturezars.com, and we'll see you next time.